Woke writing is shit. Okay, that sounded a lot more reasonable in my head, but yeah, woke writing is shit. To be clear, non woke writing can also be shit, but woke writing is always shit. Now, if you disagree with that assertion, I have some good news. That progressive piece of media you personally love and don't think is shit? Well, maybe it isn't shit, and therefore it isn't woke. Think of wokeness as a potential characteristic of storytelling, not defined by the inclusion of identity groups or progressive politics, but when the inclusion of those things is poorly implemented to the point that it hampers the overall work, turning it into shit. Wokeness is the salt that the baker confuses with sugar, making something that nobody can enjoy regardless of their taste or political inclinations. See what I just did? Now we have some common ground to stand on together. And you know that I'm right, because even the most dyed-in-the-wool leftist, even unless they're a bona fide internet shill, can admit that sometimes a piece of media tries too hard to appear woke, and it comes off as cringy shit. They see popular culture trying to appeal to their politics in a way that is so lazy, shallow, and transparent that it makes them cringe, either externally or someplace they try to hide. But let's say you're skeptical of my "we're not so different, you and I" take. Well, then allow me to demonstrate it using a property that has been more thoroughly destroyed by woke shit writing than any other: Doctor Who. What's that? You think that there are other franchises that have had it worse? Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but you're sorely mistaken. And here's a brief history into why. Doctor Who premiered in 1963, starring William Hartnell as the Doctor. Hartnell at the time was an obscure, aging actor whose career had never really left a mark on the cultural landscape. But it's never too late to turn things around, and the popularity of the show and his portrayal of the Doctor catapulted Hartnell into a cultural icon, beloved and recognized everywhere he went. Hartnell gave everything he had to the show, even when his health was failing and he could only play the Doctor reading lines from a chair. A few years after his last appearance, he died, but he died knowing that his legacy in British culture was assuredly etched in stone, as he would always be the first, the original Doctor. Then in 2020, showrunner Chris Chibnall decided to burn that legacy to the ground by writing a story in which a Doctor came before him. The Doctor had a TARDIS that looked like a police box, even though canonically that made no sense since the TARDIS turned into a police box in the very first episode with Hartnell and got stuck in that form, as it has ever since. We also learned that before this new first Doctor, there was also a hodgepodge assortment of children from a variety of races and ethnicities, and they were also the Doctor, and they also all came before Hartnell. And they did all of this, rewriting the entire 57-year canon, tearing down the legacy and accomplishments of a dead man who loved and gave everything to the show for as long as he was physically able to, for one story. And at the end of the story, the conclusion was that this entire revelation literally didn't matter. That was the lesson. None of this mattered. Not to the story, not to the characters, the writers, no one. Just accept it, stop caring. Like a child who sees another child with a toy and takes it. Not because they want it, because someone else had it and now they have to have it, so the child that did have it doesn't have it. Because the whole point is for the person to take something that isn't theirs because they have that power. So if you're a fan of Star Wars, Star Trek, Tolkien, whatever, any other franchise, and you want to plead your case, if you think it's strong, that you've had it worse, the comments section is open. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use Doctor Who as an example of the difference between writing and woke writing. It's something some of you may perceive innately, sense that in the last decade or so, something just feels off with the media that you once enjoyed. If that is the case, let me know if I was successful in properly articulating what you may struggle to define. Some of you may deny that this woke writing phenomenon even exists. It's not that the writing is worse, it's that the world is changing and it's just a reactionary segment of the audience raging against change. Well, if you're in this camp, take a look at my example and my description and show me where my error is. I'm also going to handicap myself by avoiding the Chris Chibnall, Jodie Whittaker area, because that just wouldn't be fair. Genuinely, no one likes these seasons, and they have almost no defenders at this point. Even on the most left-leaning Doctor Who-loving corners of the internet, you'll find people hand-wringing how awful these stories truly are. This is terrible, all the people who said the show was going woke are being proven right, is a common sentiment you'll find. So it really isn't fair picking on something that shit. Human Nature Family of Blood is a two-part episode that premiered in 2007 in which the Doctor and Martha Jones, his black female companion, end up at a school in rural England in 1913. Thin Ice is an episode that premiered in 2017 in which the Doctor and Bill Potts, his black female companion, travel to London in 1814. In Human Nature Family of Blood, Martha, who is undercover as a maid, experiences racism as multiple characters say racially insensitive things about her to her face. One of the students asks her how she can clean if her hands always look dirty. Another character genuinely doesn't believe that she could possibly have any knowledge of medicine because she's black. In Thin Ice, Bill also experiences racism. As the villain, an upper-class aristocrat sees her and immediately flies into a fuming rage that he is in the presence of a black woman. So he yells at her for being black until the Doctor jumps up and punches him in the face. That's it. That's what happened. Okay, that's not all that happened. See, before that happened, Bill remarks how much more diverse London was than what we often see in the movies. The Doctor smugly says that Jesus was black and history is a whitewash. Now, I'm no historian, but this is always an interesting claim to make, that European cities were more diverse than we may believe. So let's take a look at the claim. Hard data is difficult to find, as censuses didn't inquire about race and ethnicity until much later. In 1841, the first English census to inquire about where a citizen came from found that close to one-third of London's population consisted of immigrants. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Italy. Okay. Well, here's something about a more diverse London. The University of Hertfordshire went looking for images of London's diversity. Ah yes, that sounds like a robust scientific inquiry. 1. Develop hypothesis. 2. Look for evidence that proves your hypothesis correct. 3. Publish results. And what did they find? A cartoon with a black lady. Well, I guess we can throw out all the impressionist cityscapes of the day, the art form whose sole intention is to depict the impression left on the artist by what he sees. What a bunch of liars. Okay, I'm getting way off track here. In Human Nature Family of Blood, Martha experiences racism in the form of mean and insensitive remarks. These moments don't linger in the narrative for very long. They occur and then we move on from them because they aren't central to the story. Now, you can argue that this downplays racism, but I'd argue it does the opposite. These are the prejudices that people had in 1913, and as cruel as they feel to us now, they are part of our unalterable past, and we are as powerless to address them then as Martha is in the story. It's also important to consider the characters who commit them. Joan Redfern, who later becomes the Doctor, not Doctor's love interest, is on the side of good along with Martha and the Doctor. The other character, Baines, is just a spoiled asshole student who's later killed by one of the villains who then inhabits his body, making him, the real him, one of the story's victims. So the racism is committed by characters who aren't villains in the narrative, and that says something very profound about racism itself. It isn't something that's in your face, shouted from the rooftops by the most obvious of villains. It can be subtle. It can come from people with good natures and even good intentions, meaning you or I or anyone can commit it, which is both very true and very mature. Most importantly, the episode trusts us to understand all of this in its complexity. The show assumes that when characters say something racist to Martha, we aren't sitting there going, "Oh yeah, take that, Martha, you slag," because the creators assume that they don't have to hold our hand and walk us down the path towards racism bad. In Thin Ice, everything I've just said is the complete opposite. Racism comes from over-the-top cartoonish villains who shout racist things until the good character outright states that racism is bad, and then shows that by punching the caricature of evil and knocking him out. The show assumes nothing of you, the audience member, that you're even capable of having negative attitudes towards racism despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and decides that you have to be fed this like a small dog or a dull child. Whereas Human Nature depicts racism as something subtle and complex that can come from any sort of person, Thin Ice teaches us that racism comes from ridiculous avatars of evil, so don't worry, viewer, you don't ever have to consider how your own actions or attitudes may contribute to this. You're one of the good people because you're on the side of the Doctor, or more accurately, the show's creators, who aren't even capable of being racist because, look, they wrote a story about how racism is bad and punched a guy, so we're all in the clear. That's woke writing. It's writing that discards the prospect of entertaining the audience while asking thought-provoking questions in favor of, let's all sneer at the bad people and pat ourselves on the back. while making vacuous, inane observations about the world that are as deep as a puddle of piss. Contrasting these two episodes is stark, not just for the form, but for the reception. Human Nature Family of Blood is widely considered to be one of the best stories in the show's history. It treats racism as a serious subject, showing its ugliness and cruelty from complex characters, while Thin Ice is a dogshit episode that's mostly forgotten. It treats racism as nothing more than a tool, a cheap gag that the creators can toss around to feel good about themselves and hit you in the face with your hourly reminder that racism bad. And what's hilarious is that almost everything I said about Thin Ice here describes the more recent Rosa, because that's all woke writing knows how to do. It has nothing to do with creating positive change. It's just an exercise to hurl daggers at history and wank ourselves off as the most noble and enlightened generation in human history, because our pop culture woke entertainment will surely be considered timeless evidence of our innocence for generations to come. So how'd I do? Have I accurately described what you perceive in modern storytelling? Or if you disagree, do you have a better understanding of why people are so cynical towards masturbatory progressive media? If not, feel free to call me a stupid asshole in the comments, and I'll see you when I see you.